I'd like to welcome everybody to our fourth session today at the Virtual Investigative Interviewing Conference 2020. And I'm delighted to be introducing Eleonora De Michele, who is going to speak to us on interviewing children for reportable conduct investigations. So Eleonora De Michele has been working in the welfare service sector, specialising in child protection service delivery for the past 40 years in both government and non-government organisations. She has extensive experience, which includes working in frontline statutory child protection work as a caseworker and a supervisor, senior manager. She's had oversight of child protection and out-of-home care policy development and implementation as a senior child protection trainer. Eleonora has been involved in educating community services and police personnel since the early 1990s, when the New South Wales Police developed the first joint investigation teams. So Eleonora, I'm really delighted to welcome you to present to us today, and I'm very much looking forward to your session.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet, and thank you to the participants for joining me today. It's going to be a bit of an action-packed webinar. As Harriet always knows, I try and pack as much into an hour as humanly possible, and sometimes there's a difference between aspiration and delusion, so hopefully we're still in the aspiration stage. So thank you for joining us, and I also want to thank Harriet and the wonderful team at MyKludo for inviting me to participate in this important webinar series and this conference, because I think that undertaking investigations, interviewing witnesses, and in particular interviewing children, is something that from my experience as an educator, a trainer, a coach in this space, both here in Australia and internationally, it's a piece of work that even the most experienced practitioner and investigator tends to become a little bit anxious about. So today is about, I guess, just touching on some of the important components, some of the important considerations that we need to take into account when we're interviewing children of different ages and stages of development. Now, if you can hear sirens in the back, I have to apologise. I live in the inner city of Sydney and there's always sirens. So hopefully it doesn't disturb too much. Now, before we kick off, what I would like to do is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, wherever we might be sitting, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, as Harriet said, I've had a very good fortune of working both with child protection social workers, with police and other investigators in organisations who are charged with the responsibility of investigating reportable conduct, misconduct and breaches of codes of conduct. So the goal for us today is just to begin the conversation, to begin some of the work, to increase your confidence in undertaking interviews with children and young people in the context of reportable conduct, misconduct and breaches of code of conduct. Now, we know that legislation has recently been refined and amended with the transfer to the Office of the Children's Guardian if we are working in that space. But I'm not going to be touching on the legislation. I would like to focus a lot more on the little people that we're going to be interviewing to help us come to some sort of finding or some sort of decision in our investigations. So before we start, I just want to, I guess, make the assumption that all of us have a high degree of skill when it comes to interviewing witnesses, persons subject of the allegations, or people who are of interest, persons of interest. And I'm also sure that for many of us, we're also very skilled at interviewing and talking to children as well. So I'm going to invite you just to do a bit of a reflection and think about a time that you interviewed a child, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a work context. It could be like interviewing your child about what their day was like at school. And you were able to do that really well. You felt really good about your practice, and it was a time that you thought, I've actually made a difference here. I've connected with this child. So I'm going to invite you to think specifically about what did you do and what did you say at this moment that you were most proud of. Now, I'm going to invite you, if possible, to pop one or two comments in the chat box or the Q&A, just so that we know what your reflections are. But just think about a time that you think, well, I actually did a good job. And this is what I did and this is what I said, so that we can share some of the experience of the listeners today. So just spend a minute doing that, and we'll see if we can get the technology to work in our favour. I'm not sure whether this is working, Harriet.
Yeah, if people would like to just pop an answer in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Yep, we have one up now. I think people just maybe not so brave.
Absolutely. Kept my questions really simple. Fantastic. Yeah. Or increased my volume a little bit. I thought you said that to the child. Is that better? Is it? Okay. Built rapport. Fabulous. Okay. Or the tone used and simple language. Fantastic. Sarah's comment is a really useful one, because what we know, and certainly it's been my experience of interviewing many children, is that tone of voice is far more important than the content of the question itself. So if we think about relationship and rapport building being as the foundation stones, then it's built with content. So what are the questions that we want to ask the children? What's the information that we want to glean from the child? And process, making sure that your tone is warm, welcoming, and elicits some sort of information. Now, I'm just going to move us along from here. So I guess that one of the things that I'm hearing from all the participants is that we as practitioners know that to undertake a quality interview with children, we really need to show respect to the children and young people that we're working with, and also to place the child's needs first in the interview. Young children do tire. They might need to have a break. They might need to have a drink. They might need to go to the bathroom, etc. So it's making sure that we attend to the needs of the children so that they can then focus on the conversation that we're having with them. The other thing that a competent interviewer does is it makes sure that they make sure that the children are informed about the interview. So an explanation about, I'm going to be asking you lots of questions today because it's important that I hear how things are going. And also we consider their wishes, consistent with their age and ability. So if the child feels much more comfortable sitting on the floor, then on the floor we go. Or if the child feels much more comfortable, for many of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that I interviewed, they much prefer to sit under a tree or on the riverbank so that they could be with nature and be able to tell me their stories in a much more comfortable context. The other thing, and it was very much highlighted in the comments today, is establishing that rapport with children and young people from the minute we say, hello, my name is. Because we're going to be inviting children to tell us stories or tell us about events that are based on possible harm. And certainly we're going to be interested in breaches of codes of conduct or reportable conduct or misconduct. So we're wanting to put the child's anxieties at bay, or trying to manage them as well as possible, and also communicate with the children depending on their age and stage of development, and also gender, and also cultural implications as well. From my experience of working with other communities or children from diverse communities, expecting a child to maintain eye contact can sometimes be unrealistic and also unfair for the child. So it's being really clear about what's the cultural milieu that this child has come from, and what does that mean in the way that I exchange information, ask questions, conduct my body language, etc. Okay, the other thing that a competent interviewer does is sensitively questions the child about the information that they might be able to share with us. Now, for some practitioners, their anxiety levels are often as high as, if not higher, than the children that they're working with. So sometimes the questions can unintentionally be delivered like an interrogation. So sensitive questioning also means taking account of pace, timing, the delivery, etc. And also, being able to respond to any distress or upset that the child may experience during the interview. Now, a child crying during an interview is not unusual because sometimes they feel embarrassed or shameful, or they feel guilt about what's happened to them, and they might start to cry. But my experience is that an empathic interviewer who responds to the child warmly is able to keep that child in the interview and keep the child going in the interview with just some simple reassurances. Okay, now I'm not going to spend too long on the functions of interviews with children and young people in the context of reportable conduct, misconduct and breaches of codes of conduct, because it's an assumption that if we're going to do this work, we'll have an understanding of what the functions of the interviews are there for. But certainly, as we approach the interview and we start to do the planning and the preparation components of the good practice, we need to be really clear that we're there to learn the child's account of circumstances that prompted the inquiry. Now, although that sounds fairly obvious, sometimes in the rush of doing investigations or in the anxiety of making sure that we get it right, we can inadvertently or unintentionally bring our assumptions and our bias into our conversations with the children and young people. So sometimes anxious practitioners go into the interview with the child wanting to confirm the story that the investigator has already got developed in their mind, rather than actually just being there as a facilitator of the child's account. Now, clearly, we're going to be interviewing the children to help us decide and make a quality decision around whether abuse, misconduct, reportable conduct has occurred, yes or no. And also, as practitioners, particularly in the area of out-of-home care or in child protection or in schools, anywhere where children frequent and it's part of the core business of the organisation, we also need to assess risk. How risky is this person to the organisation and to the child and to the class of children that might be involved in the organisation and in the investigation? Because clearly we're going to need to plan in an intervention, not only for this particular child that we're interviewing, but for all the children that might be involved in the agency that we're undertaking this investigation for. Okay. Now, I want us to dive into the interview framework itself. Now, this interview framework is the framework that's been used with great success both here in New South Wales, also in other jurisdictions in Australia, and also internationally. It reflects very well the frameworks that are used in the UK and also the United States. So I always say that once we have a bit of a framework, then we can work flexibly. Now, clearly the first step in undertaking a good quality interview with children and young people is planning and preparation. And I'd actually say that multiplied by 3. And, just 15 minutes of planning and preparation can sometimes save days of damage control when an interview is derailed, not by the child, but by the interviewer who hasn't had enough preparation time. So planning and preparation around, what is the information that we're after? What is the allegation that we're being presented with? What's the information that I need to gather to be able to come up with a good quality decision is your first base. And then thinking through, okay, how do I elicit that information and explore that information with the particular child that I'm working with? Now, the interview framework has a nice flow to the structure, where we introduce ourselves. And in that introduction, we're also going to be, sharing with the child and young person, the purpose of the interview. So what are we there to talk about? And then we're going to be undertaking some sort of rapport building so that The child feels much more comfortable speaking with you, particularly if the child doesn't know you. We're asking them to disclose information to a complete stranger, and adults would find that difficult, and we're working with children here. Then we're going to be raising the allegation in a non-leading way, and then invite the child to give us a free narrative. Invite them to tell us everything that they can recall of that particular event. And then if needed, we're going to gather the specific details to enable us to get breadth and depth to the story, to be able to make a fair decision based on natural justice to the person subject of the allegation. And then once we feel that we have enough information to, if not complete the interview, but at least to initiate some action, and that's all the child is able to do on that particular day, then we'd need to start to close the interview down. And there are some things to cover there. And obviously post-interview planning is an absolute necessity after that interview. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly go through the common elements of a interview with a child. And these are, I guess, these ideas are reflective of the standard protocols that you'll find in use in many jurisdictions. So in terms of the greeting and rapport building with the child, one of the things that you are wanting to explore in the early stages of that interview is what exactly is this child capable of doing in terms of giving an account of events. So you're doing a bit of an assessment of capabilities, and also you're going to be establishing some ground rules so the child knows really clearly what they need to talk about and what we need to put a pause on and maybe discuss a little later. So we're going to establish some ground rules with the children to help them, to help guide them through the nature of the interview. Then we're going to be introducing the topic of the day, and this is where we're going to introduce the purpose of the interview to the child in a non-leading way. And some examples of that we'll be exploring in a little while, but it could be as simple as my job is to make sure that kids are safe where they live, but also where they come and play or when they come and study. And I want to talk to you today about how things are going. And then you can either reiterate or introduce the ground rules if you haven't done so already. Now, in the free narrative component, you're also going to invite the child to give an account of everything that they can remember of the event from the beginning to the end. Now, what we know is that children are much more skilled at free narrative and have got greater recall around free narrative than cued recall. However, they do need some help in sharing that free narrative with us, and we'll cover that in a little while. And then you might need to consider the specific questions. Are there any questions that we need to pose to the child to fill the gaps in the details or to clear up any apparent or obvious inconsistencies in the child's story? So thinking through, what else do I need to know to be able to come up with a quality decision? And then at the closure, you're going to be summarising what the child's told you and to clear up any misunderstandings or missing information. Sometimes in the busyness of doing the interview, the child has a piece of information that we haven't offered them the opportunity to share with us, and now's the time to ask the child whether they have anything else that they can tell us. Okay, now the model that, and some of the premises that myself and many other practitioners who teach, coach and train investigators is the cognitive interviewing model. And this is the work of Gieselman et al. And the cognitive interviewing model has 4 stages. And the first stage, and I'm sure that many of our listeners are cognizant of this framework. The first stage is where the witness reconstructs the context. So they give a description of the environmental and personal context of the event. So where were you when this happened? Who else was there when this was happening. And then the next element of the cognitive interviewing framework that is really useful for children is that the witness reports all their recollected details, regardless of their perceived importance. So as interviewers, we're going to be asking the child to say, tell me what happened when you were slapped by your teacher at preschool. Start from the beginning and finish at the end, and try not to leave anything out. So a nice little open-ended question. And even young children are capable of understanding that instruction and can give some narrative around that. Now, in older children, and certainly with adults, we can then move into the stages 3 and 4 of the cognitive interviewing process. However, what I'm going to suggest is that young children are not capable of 3 and 4, where they give alternative perspectives and give it in different order. Young children's accounts are significantly enhanced by the first 2 steps. Children have to relay their story to us in a chronologically correct order. It's like, for anyone who can remember the old vinyl LPs, is that we need to go in a particular order. We can't go backwards, particularly with young children. Now, our older children can undertake the all 4 steps, but we're talking about 13, 14-year-old young people, not young children, certainly not under the ages of 8 or 9. Okay, now let's think about what our role is when we're interviewing children. What we are attempting to do is to help children and young people remember their story, to remember the event, but without influencing what they're remembering. Now, we had a fabulous session just prior to this one around memory, so I'm not going to talk too much about memory. However, there are 2 components of cognitive competence that relates to children that's important for us as practitioners to know about. And that's the concepts of meta-memory and metacognition. Now, meta-memory is knowing what you remember, what you sort of remember, and what you don't remember. So it's knowing about your memories. Now, I'm going to do a little experiment with you, and I'm going to invite you to think back to an event that happened, maybe 2 or 3 months ago. For some of us, we were in lockdown. For some of us, it was the first time that we were able to leave our homes for a while in this crazy COVID times. But I want you to think about an event where there was a gathering of people. It could be further back in time, around Christmas or whatever. I want you to just follow my questions. I want you to think, can you remember where you were? And can you remember who was with you? And can you remember what you were wearing during that particular day or during that particular event? And can you remember what everybody else was wearing on that particular day? Do you remember the conversations that were had? Now, as I'm going through those questions, some of us are thinking, oh yeah, I absolutely remember where I was. Yeah, and I was wearing, this is exactly what I was wearing. And some of us going, yeah, I remember who was there, but I can't really, if I thought about it long and hard enough, I would be able to remember what people were wearing. But no, really, the conversations, I can't remember at all. That's the meta memory of an adult. Adults are really clear about what they clearly remember, what they sort of kind of remember if they put a bit of extra thought into it or got a couple of prompts, and what they absolutely can't remember at all. Now, children don't have that degree of metamemory developed. So children can be quite easily influenced by suggestive leading questions. And if we had more time, I'd share a number of stories where I did some experiments with young children and invited them to recall an adult that they had an interaction with. And the children initially said, no, I can't remember that person. But with my persistent leading questioning, yes, you do. You remember that person. You remember that they had a checkered shirt on. And remember they had sort of a little bit of bad breath. The children would not only recall that person and remember the checkered shirt and the fact that the person had a little bit of bad breath, they then added to the narrative. So they embellished the narrative, even though that person was completely fictitious. Now, that's similar to metacognition. Now, if I invited you to think about a piece of legislation that you know reasonably well and started to question you about the different sections of that legislation, what does section 10 relate to? What does section 248 relate to? Some of us will be, yep, I know exactly what that section relates to. At other moments, you'll be saying, oh, I should know this, for heaven's sakes. And other parts of the legislation, you're going to think, no, I've got no idea what that's about. Again, that's adult metacognition, where we're very, very clear about what we do know, what we sort of kind of know, and then what we don't know. Again, children don't have such well-developed metacognition. So again, are easily influenced by persistent interviewing and questioning about a particular issue, because children will start to think that they've got the answer wrong, and they will start to, I guess, no, I don't want to use the word fabricate or make up, but they will start to grasp at answers to help please you. So we need to be very careful about the persistence and the repetition of questions and ask ourselves, why do I need to know that information? Is there a more simple way of gathering that information than this particular line of questioning? Now, there are 3 other areas that we need to be mindful of when we're interviewing children. And I think that this is something that I invite the listeners to take some time to do further research. We don't have time today, but certainly I would be inviting you to really have a look at what's the language competence of this particular child that you're working with. What's the psychological competence? How much stress can they manage? And also, what's their emotional competence? Some children who've experienced trauma are easily triggered, and so need to be supported very carefully in the questioning throughout the interview. So, okay. Now, these are just some, I guess, general principles in interviewing children. And I really want to stress the point that we don't question children as a group. Children are not a homogenous, cookie cutter group of individuals. We actually interview one unique child at a time. So that really requires us to do some preparation and some research around what's this child's abilities. The other thing that we want to be mindful of is that language is shaped by experience, family context, and also by culture. Some children are encouraged very strongly by their family, by their social experiences, etc., to talk, whereas other children have a much less robust history of answering open-ended questions. They're much more familiar with closed information-specific questions like the yes-no answers. Now, one of the things that we need to be mindful of, and this comes from neuroscience, and it's the wonderful work of Dr. Bruce Perry, and he discovered in his work that children experience stress from any questioning from an adult. So a child who is asked a question by an adult that is positive, what presents did you get for your birthday? Could be benign. Have you had your breakfast this morning? Or did you have breakfast this morning? Or negative, tell me, how did that person hurt you? All children experience a stress response, particularly if they're being interviewed by an adult that they don't know. So, what we do know is that interview stress may negatively influence retrieval memory. We know that abuse and harm can actually increase the memory of an event, but the recounting of that event to someone that they don't know or feel anxious around can actually negatively influence their ability to recall that memory. Now, the other thing that I want us to I guess, really see as a touchstone is that inconsistency in children's account of events is normal, similar to adults. So if I was going to ask you about that event that I was inviting you to recall, about where you were, who was there, in the first telling of the story, you might remember certain aspects of that event in your narrative. And in the second invitation to tell me that story, you might remember that you had a bit of an argument with someone that you forgot to tell me in the first telling, or in the second telling, you felt a bit more comfortable with me to be able to share that piece of information. So it was actually withheld information, not forgotten information. So human beings in their narratives over time may change the content, but it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that there's a little bit of inconsistency, and it's very normal. Now, the other thing that we need to be mindful of when we're interviewing children is that children are very literal in their approach to language. I can recall, and this is just a classic example, I can recall I was speaking to my little 4-year-old nephew who was telling me with great enthusiasm about his trip to the museum recently to have a look at the dinosaur exhibition. And I was, very interested in that story. And I posed a question to him. Oh, how did you find it? I was asking, and I will ask you, what do you think I was asking about? Some of us will be thinking, did my little nephew enjoy the dinosaur exhibition? And some of us will be thinking, just like my little nephew did, was how did they actually get there? So the response I was after was around enjoyment. The response that I actually got was, Mum and I got in the car, then we went down the street and we had to turn a corner and we had to go into this big building. So I got the directions to the museum. And but with all of that, what we do know is that even very young children can be competent witnesses in a court of law if they're able to provide their story to someone who is supportive, empathic, and enables them to tell their full story. Children are able to recall their stories much more confidently and competently in the future if we provided them with the opportunity to tell their full story in the first place. So our skill is a very important component. Now, listen, the other thing that I really want us to just spend a bit of time having a look at, and this is an important element for any investigator, particularly an investigator that has received only very little information in terms of case information. And it may be that we're one of the first people that is going to invite the child to tell us the full story. Now, I want to say something really clearly and really loudly, because this is an important point for all investigators, is that children choose who they disclose to. Now, I'm going to repeat that. Children choose who they disclose to. And sometimes we're going to be the first person that child chooses to disclose to. Now, the other things that we know about disclosure, and this is, something that we're hoping that all children do in our investigations, is that disclosure is a process. It's a process that leads up to the actual conversation. There's a lot of internal dialogue that happens for children and young people. Should I tell? Who should I tell? How much should I tell them? What if I get into trouble? What if they don't believe me? So there's a lot of thinking that the child is going through in the lead up to the actual disclosure of the information. And also that the disclosure process means that some children will give you a small amount of information in the initial stages, just to see how you're tracking with that little bit of information, to see how you're going to handle the more elaborate and sometimes more abusive part of the story. So this is some work that was done by some brilliant psychologists and researchers and therapists who've been working with children and young people for many, many years, Sorensen and Snow. And they found in their research, and it's very well supported by other research, is that the starting block for most children when they're about to disclose or when they are initially questioned about the possibility of misconduct or reportable conduct or breaches of codes of conduct, even if they have disclosed to someone else, like a teacher or to a parent, when investigators start the investigation, a significant proportion of the children start with denial, and they say no, nothing happened, or they withhold their disclosure. So they'll choose not to speak. Now, a wise practitioner, a wise investigator will absolutely anticipate this in every single interview that they do. So in the planning and preparation phase, you're going to be asking yourself, what am I going to say? How am I going to reassure the child if they deny or withhold the disclosure? Now, they might be denying or withholding because there actually isn't a story to be told. And we would be so thankful if the child hasn't been harmed or exposed to reportable conduct. But we need to anticipate that a significant proportion of the children are going to start from this starting block. And what we know from the research is that children, when they are given very reassuring statements like my job is to make sure that you're safe, there's nothing that you can tell me that will upset me, you have done nothing wrong, then most children will venture into a tentative disclosure, where they start to give you a bit of a snippet of what's happened to see what your response is like. And then if our response is supportive and what I call beige, so we don't act shocked or we don't, we act very supportive of the child, then most children, 93% of children will go into an active disclosure. Now you'll see on the screen, there's also a red arrow there. Now some kids don't start with denial or withholding or tentative disclosure. They have been waiting for you to come and talk to them forever. And they just go straight into an active disclosure. They want someone to listen to their story. They want someone to do something about what's happening to them. So some kids will go into an active disclosure and tell you this is exactly what's been going on. They may only tell you a small part of it, but they'll give you the depth of detail to at least initiate some action on your part. Now, what we do know is that anxiety, guilt, shame, blame is a common experience for children who've experienced trauma, and it's a common experience for children who are also disclosing that trauma. They feel very ashamed of what's happened, even though they had no control over it. So it's not unusual, and it's something we need to anticipate as practitioners, that many children are going to retract their story. They're going to wish that they hadn't told. So a wise practitioner, before ending the interview with the child, is going to anticipate this with the child, where we have a quick conversation with the child to say, look, my experience with working with lots of other children is that sometimes they wish they hadn't told, because this is the point when parents become upset about what's happened to their child, school systems or child-focused agencies become upset about what's happened in their agency, etc. And the child experiences that as a lot of pressure to take their story back. They feel responsible for what is happening in the adult world. So a wise investigator will talk to the child about the possibility of them wanting to take their story back, and what can they do and who can they talk to so they stay true to their story. Now, clearly a wise investigator will also be talking to the support person who's with the child, or a parent who is supportive, to anticipate retraction as well, so that they can help support the child in a non-leading way. Because children who are given reassurances that retraction is possible, or even if they have retracted, that it's okay, over 90% of children who retract then go on to reconfirm the story. So I'd really encourage you to focus a lot of thinking in your preparation time on how might you cover the issue of retraction with the child before you end the interview that you're undertaking. Now, there's lots of things that influence a child's disclosure. I'm only going to talk to 5 of the most common ones. And there's a lot that I'd like to cover, but we're rapidly running out of time. There's the whole issue of secret keeping. And there's been lots of lovely little experiments done by psychologists all over the world around children's secret keeping behaviour. And what we know is that young children in particular, for the 4 to 6 year olds, when it comes to keeping secrets, particularly to protect someone who is near and dear to them, they keep those secrets come hell or high water. And they will only disclose if they're reassured that they're not going to get into trouble and that you're going to work very hard to help the person that they're worried about. So even though it might be a teacher, they might have a strong fondness for that teacher that you're investigating. So young children need a lot of reassurance that you're going to be working with everybody to make sure that everybody is okay. The other thing that comes up very strongly in the research, and certainly has been my experience as a child protection practitioner, is children's previous experience around telling. One of the most devastating things that can happen for children is to develop the courage to tell, and to tell someone and then nothing happens. So one of the tips that I would give as a seasoned practitioner is to make sure that once we receive this information, that we reassure the child that you're going to do the best that you can to move this forward and to make sure that they are safe. And then there's also the distinction that we need to be mindful of in terms of the difference between the child's ability to remember and also the willingness to disclose. Some less than seasoned practitioners, when the child is saying, oh, I don't know, assume that the child isn't able to tell the story, whereas actually what they're doing is being reluctant and that they're withholding the disclosure. It's not that they can't remember it. Now, there are factors that do influence the child in terms of their age, their gender, and also who the person was that harmed them. If it's someone that's close to them, children will need a lot of reassurance that telling on someone who's near and dear to them is actually a good idea. So we need to be mindful of that, and also to be mindful of the response of the people around the child in terms of the disclosure. How are parents going to respond once they hear that their child is being harmed or there's been some reportable conduct with their child? Now, some parents immediately support the child with great zeal, and that can put some pressure on the kids too, because because their parents are upset. And sometimes parents, it's been my experience, actually find it quite difficult to believe the story if we have someone who has groomed not only the child but has groomed the parents as well. So again, we need to be thinking through what's been the reach of this person in terms of grooming the children and grooming the context in which that child is. And then we've also got the motivation to provide false reports. Now, I think that this is something that most investigators are really anxious about. Is this a vexatious or malicious disclosure? What we do know is that malicious and vexatious disclosures by children, particularly young children, are very rare. More often than not, if a child is giving a false statement, they've been coached by an adult with an alternative agenda. So again, we need to be thinking through who else is involved in this investigation and what's their motive to possibly influence what the child is telling you on the day. Okay. Now, just some barriers, and I'm just going to let you quickly read the screen. But one of the things that I think all of us understand implicitly is that for a child to disclose harm, they feel incredible shame, embarrassment. They're really worried about what the impression is that they're giving you. They're worried about what the family is going to know about what's happened. But the last point on the screen, I think, even in 2020, it's one of the most common worries for children is that they're frightened that if they tell, no one's going to believe them. And once the disclosure is out, once the secret is out, then who is going to protect them if no one believes them? So it's incredible food for thought for us as practitioners. Now, what I'm going to invite you to do is just to reflect for a second and just sit there quietly at your desk or wherever you might be, and just to think, okay, what does this mean? What does this information that we've covered so far mean for me as an interviewer? And what does it mean in terms of tailoring my current approach to interviewing children in the various workplaces or in the various contexts that I go? So I'm just going to give you just literally 10 seconds to reflect on that, because I'm going to try and get us through at least the introduction stage of the interview so that we can use some tools and techniques to use with children. Okay. What I'd like to do in this next little bit of time, because the time has absolutely evaporated and I knew I was delusional rather than aspirational in the amount that I wanted to cover, is I'd like to cover the introduction rapport building phase of the interview. Because from my experience of interviewing many, many children and training and coaching and supporting and debriefing practitioners, police, social workers, investigators in their practice, we all know that the introduction and rapport building phase is one of the most important aspects of the interview. This is where and I always say, if you don't think the child is checking you out while we're checking them out, then we're a little naive, because this is where the child is evaluating, am I going to disclose to this person, yes or no? Because children choose who they disclose to. Now, there are some things that we need to cover in the introduction rapport building phase of an interview that has been shown to have great efficacy across time and space. Many practitioners in New South Wales and other jurisdictions that I train and coach use a form of this introduction to centre the child on the conversation. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the more obvious ones. So clearly we need to focus the child and the young person on the interview, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be incredibly formal. As I said, I've sat on riverbanks, I've played hopscotch while I've interviewed a child, almost killed me. It was a nightmare for the recorder, but it was the only way that I could get the child to speak. So getting the child to focus on the conversation is step one. Now, clearly introducing yourself and your co-worker, explaining your role, what your job is, and also the recording. Now, if you've got audio recording, we need to, as we know, declare that up to the child. If we're videotaping, we also need to get the child's consent to videotape or to audio tape, and that needs to be audible on those recording mechanisms. But if you've got someone who is taking verbatim notes, then it might be an opportunity for them to explain to the child, look, you can see that I'm doing a lot of writing because what you have to tell us is really important, and I want to make sure that we have everything written down. So it's a way of introducing the child, your colleague, into the conversation with the child. Now, I've got this in an order that isn't static. This is a fluid order, but I just needed to put it in some order on the PowerPoint. So clearly you're going to briefly explain to the child why you're speaking with them. So it could be that, they've made a disclosure to the teacher's told them that they need to speak to somebody else, and you arrive. So it could be as simple as, your teacher, did your teacher tell you that I was coming today? Child says yes. What do you know? How come I'm talking to you today? How come we're having a chat? And you can invite the child to explain it to you. Or if the child doesn't know that you're coming, then to use a general introduction. I'm here to have a bit of a chat around what happened at camp on the weekend. I want to talk about the things that you enjoyed, but also if there was anything that you didn't enjoy. That's what we need to talk about today. But it needs to be non-leading in that approach. Now, we need to begin to build trust with the child, because again, they're evaluating you as we're evaluating them. So we want to reassure the child that they're not in trouble. They're not speaking to you because they've done anything wrong. You're just very curious about what they have to tell us. So reassure the child that they're not in trouble and that you're wanting to help make sure that they're safe. Now, if you want to promote some communication and check capabilities, the way that I tend to do it, and a number of practitioners do, is just to invite the child to just share an event, a pleasant event that they did on the weekend. They might have gone bowling or played some sport, and you might want to say, look, I wasn't there when you were playing basketball on Saturday with your friends. Tell me everything that happened from the beginning to the end, from when you got to the courts to when you left the courts, just to see how well the child can give a free narrative. And then we're going to be looking at helping the child or young person understand the rules of the conversation. Now, these are the three that I tend to focus on from experience and also from the research. It's really important. And the first one we're going to ask the child is, you need to let me know if I use words that are too big. Because here we're going to be checking for age inappropriate language. When we get nervous, we tend to retreat into bureaucracies or the language of our profession. And sometimes it leaves kids floundering, wondering what we're talking about. So the first one is about words that are too big. The second one is about, I might ask you questions where you don't know the answer. That's okay. It's important that we don't make anything up today. You just answer the questions that you know. And what this is checking for is you leading, is you might be focusing on your assumptions rather than the child's narrative. And then the last one is a really important one. And if there's one that you avoid forgetting, it's this one here, because this is where some children shut down because they're at the point of disclosure, but they're struggling. Should I, shouldn't it? And you're going to explain to the child, I might ask you questions where you know the answer, but it's hard to tell. And what can you tell me? What can you say to me if you know the answer, but it's hard to tell? Now, I'd really encourage, and I've seen some practitioners who are new to the investigations game say, if you know the answer, but it's hard to tell, that's okay. You don't have to tell me. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. So you might say it's hard to tell, and I might ask the question in another way. Then we need to cover the establishing of the truth and lies. This is like the form of the jurat, where we're asking the child to make a commitment and an agreement to only tell the truth today. So this is establishing the child's competence in law. And it needs to be done, and we need to make sure that we have the agreement either audible or written down in the notes. And the last thing that you might want to do is, although you might have started the interview, sometimes, kids for some reason don't necessarily resonate with you, or you don't resonate with them. They actually resonate with your colleague. So be prepared to ask that question and then to swap over roles. Now, these are just some tools that I've used in my practice to help with the group rules. I can use the bears if I'm working with younger children. So my green bear there is the card that I show the child. I might ask you questions that you don't know the answer. It could be like you're feeling like the green card bear. What can you say to me if you don't know the answer? And then the red card bear is where I might be asking you questions that you know the answer, but it's hard to tell. What can you then say? Or the other tool, I literally just developed this the other day because I forgot the cards, is the stop signs, where the child can press the red button or the amber button or the green button to help me understand whether they don't understand the words, don't understand the question, or it's a too hard a question to answer. So you can use those techniques. This is another tool that you can use, and I picked this up when I was doing my master qualifications in forensic interviewing in the US. And this is inviting the child who can't really give you a clear description about what telling the truth is or about what telling a lie is. And this is a third person process, because I would strongly discourage practitioners from saying, if I said that I was wearing a blue shirt when I'm actually wearing a white one, am I telling the truth or telling a lie? The research has shown us, and it came out in the Royal Commission again as well, that children find those styles of questions very coercive and very stressful, because they're being invited to tell a stranger that they think that they're a liar. So I tend to encourage you developing a little diagram like this, where you've got two little friends. They're observing. You're saying, what do you see here? It's a teddy bear. If this little boy is telling his friend that that's a teddy bear, is he telling the truth or is he telling a lie? He's telling the truth. How do you know? Because it is a teddy bear. But what about this other little boy here? If he's trying to tell his friend that that's not a teddy bear, that's a book, is he telling his friend the truth or is he telling his friend a lie? He's telling a lie. How come? Because it's a book. And then we just summarize by saying, today it's very important that we only do what this little boy here is doing, saying that it's a teddy bear and telling the truth. And that's how you get your agreement. So it's a nice little easy practice tool to, establish that child's competence in law. Now, I was going to get you to do a little experiment, but I know that I have almost completely run out of time. So I'm just going to invite you to maybe think of this part of the interview and decide, okay, which of those tools could I possibly use in the next interview that I do for a young child? Young kids with disabilities, with moderate to mild learning disabilities, can also understand those concepts. Kids with severe disabilities might need alternative support in making those disclosures. So have a bit of a practice as you go through. But one of the things, I guess it'll be one of the final messages that I give to practitioners listening, is that we need to be really mindful of how easily children are influenced by persistent questioning and in terms of their suggestibility. So we've got to be really careful about inducements. Look, just, if you hurry up and tell me what's happened, we can go to Macca's and get some burgers or get a milkshake. Oppressive or coercive interviewing styles, which is often just a battery of closed questions where the child isn't able to be able to tell their story, or the delivery is way too quick. Kids think slower than we do in terms of retrieving memories and then developing the narrative to help us understand their experiences. The other thing that we need to be mindful of, and the next two, is the coaching and the non-neutral encouragement, because we all work in this field because we've got a real commitment to the safety of children, and most of us are either parents or we have children in our lives that we love and adore. So we're very used to encouraging the kids. Tell me what was, how your day was. I'm sure that you were great at that. I'm sure that you were fabulous. In an interview context, that would be viewed very strongly as coaching the child to come up with particular information. And certainly children are very vulnerable to non-neutral encouragement. So I've got down the bottom there. We really need to be beige. Yes, I can see that you know your numbers. I see that you can tell the time, etc., etc. So doing that in a really beige way. Okay, now I think, Harriet, I might have run out of time.
I think you've come very close to the end. Was there a final, have you said what you would like to say, or is there a final comment there, Eleonora?
Oh, look, I've got more tools. I've got a whole lot of other stuff that we can talk about. But listen, I think that one of the final comments that I'd like to say to all the practitioners is that doing a good interview with a child takes a lot of practice. Most of us can feel quite anxious about it. And I'll also suggest that most of us have conversations with children on a daily basis. We inquire about our children's days at school or events in life. It's just refining the existing skills that you have and tailoring them to the individual child that you're working with, so that they are willing, able and confident to make a disclosure to you, because children choose who they disclose to. So I think I'll leave it there, Harriet.
All right, thank you very much, Eleonora. That was a really excellent, practical application of some of the information that we've had earlier today, but really useful tips there for practitioners. And thinking about your questions about what tools could you use, I particularly liked your traffic light responses and that ability to empower children to say, oh, I know the answer, but it's too difficult to tell. Yeah. And I can relate to that very strongly, because one of my children has been in a few situations at school where that's been the case, and they just become completely mute in the face of teachers' questions. Yeah. But when you're able to take them out of that pressured situation, they're able to kind of say, well, I knew what I wanted to say, but I was never going to tell them.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it was too difficult to express themselves. Yeah. So I think that was really, really useful strategy. So I'm just wondering if there's anybody has any, we've got time for 5 minutes for some questions. If anybody listening has any questions, if they'd like to pop them in the Q&A box. It always takes a while for people to decide whether they want to pop anything in there.
Yep.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. She said a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone wrote follow-up questions. Now, clearly every open-ended question that we're going to, now we don't have time in this short webinar, and hopefully we'll cross paths in other learning opportunities, is that, you know, we're going to ask children open-ended questions, and we're going to balance that with specific questions. So, you know, and specific statements like, tell me more about that. How exactly did that happen? So it's a lovely dance between open-ended statements or open-ended questions with, tell me a little bit more about that part when you got smacked. How were you smacked? And you're getting the detail of that. So just after you were smacked, what happened then? So it's a lovely dance of open-ended with specific, and that helps us get the full detail of the narrative the child has available to us.
So, Eleonora, there is a question about publications from Amanda, and what I'll do is I'll get some information from you, and we can forward that to participants
Sure.
after, well, at some point during this week. I think that's the commitment I'll make on that one. But there's another question from Ian. So how do you assess whether to treat a person as a child, a young person, or an adult?
Right, great question. I mean, in the jurisdiction where I sit, that's legally defined. So a child under the reportable conduct legislation is anyone under the age of 18. In the child protection legislation, it's slightly different. A child is anyone under the age of 16, and a young person is anyone between 16 and 18. And anyone over 18 is an adult. Now, that's in terms of chronological age. Developmental age, you would need to have a look at doing some research around what is this person's level of functioning? What's their age and stage of development? You know, people with disabilities may have a certain chronological age, but have a cognitive capacity and a linguistic capacity that is much younger. So there's the legal definitions, and then there's the realistic definitions of who is this person that I'm sitting next to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eleonora. Are there any other questions? I think that probably answers them all. So I'd just like to say a big thank you, Elle, for your presentation today and your time. And the next session we have on is for the conferences at 9 o'clock Sydney, Melbourne time. So that's 8 a.m. if you're in Brisbane. It's even earlier if you're in Perth. And as for the rest of the globe, I have no idea. But if that's so 9 a.m. Sydney, Melbourne time tomorrow, and that is Greg Lamey, who's talking about the practical applications of the peace model, which some of you may be familiar with already. So thank you very much, Elle. And
thank you. Thanks, Harriet. Thank you, everybody, for participating. It was wonderful.
Bye.